in order to maintain effective registers, therefore, the register would have to specify the type of deposit and the situation and the activity that that person is registered as a competent person in relation to. Then you get into the difficult situation of, well, now you have to divide up all the deposit types in the world into certain categories like porphyry copper deposits, epithermal gold deposits, and so on. Having said that, clearly there are registers, so it's being made to work. How effectively it works, I'm not actually sure. To go back to the application to seabed nodules, I think now we're into an area where we're talking about one specific deposit type. I mean, I'm sure there are variations on a theme, but we're talking about nodules on the seabed floor. So I think there is an opportunity here, if we wanted to go that way, to have some role for the ISA, perhaps, in recognising people who have the appropriate experience and skills in order to be recognised as a competent and qualified person here. So I think perhaps this is an opportunity where a register of some sort, or a recognition, it could actually be made to work.
You had said that also that one of the requirements is that they be a member of the, not specific, but one of the recognized professional societies. I know in some societies they have a special category for professionals. Do all of the organizations have that? I mean, in SME they do have a higher category, but subject to that discipline that you mentioned.
Yes.
Do other ones have that?
Some do, I believe. I think in Europe, one of the professional societies in Europe, I think, may have that. The reason that was brought in, as I understand it, for the SME was because the SME, I believe, is not structured as an organisation that can discipline its members. I think it's more of a learned society. Now, I might be wrong, but that's my understanding. And so in order to satisfy the requirements to be a competent person, or for an organisation to meet the requirements, it must have the ability to bring its members to account. So they had to create a special category that they could do that with. So all the organisations, I understand, that are recognised within the CRISCO group of companies have that mechanism in place. So it's a matter of, I think for seabed nodules, it would be a matter of being a member of an appropriate professional organisation that has that capability. And I think it's also important that that organisation be asked to verify that it would discipline the person if they were found to be in breach. In the past, a whole lot of organisations have been added to that list without anybody ever going to them and saying, would you actually discipline a person in that situation? They didn't even know they were on the list. So, you know, obviously that doesn't work. So I think, again, it could be made to work.
Thank you very much. Your presentation was very, very helpful for me personally to understand this assessment and classification of the resources. I would like to concentrate my question on the mining technology. The difference between resource and reserve, the mineability, the technological mineability must be included, taken into account to make a clear difference. The CRISCO is handling the solid minerals. The manganese nodules are solid minerals. However, the production technology or mining technology is more similar to oil and gas industries, offshore engineering technologies. In this sense, UNFC is collaborating with the CRISCO and SPE for oil and gas energies. And therefore, my question is, who is in the position to judge the technological readiness, proven technology, whether mining technology technology is proven or still probable in the state, in the position of this Crisco, who is in charge for such a technological judgment?
Again, it comes back to the competent person who's nominated. For example, the competent person for reporting of mineral resources would probably not be the competent person who is responsible for the reporting of the mineral reserves. The reporting of the mineral reserves would usually involve several competent persons or qualified persons, each taking responsibility for an area that's of particular importance. Not every single aspect of the estimation of reserves has to be subject to a competent person, but the critical ones do have to be. So certainly mining technology in this case would be one, processing would be another. And I can't really answer your question. Well, I think it's one that we need to talk about here today. What I will say is that in order to convert a resource to a reserve, you must go through a study that's at least a pre-feasibility study as it's defined, and that sets out, so there are guidelines as to what is expected to be done in the pre-feasibility study. So I think we would need to take those into account in forming that view as to what degree does the mining recovery technology need to be proved in order to allow us to report it as a reserve. I think that's one of the questions definitely to be resolved or addressed.
Thank you. Actually, if I could expand on that a little bit from my viewpoint. I think a lot of the definitions around reserves and resources in terms of technology that we use now are based on the principles of generally accepted engineering principles or generally accepted practices. You don't have any generally accepted practices yet. So what you really need to do is a group, I think the ISA or the deep sea mining industry, that's why you need to come up with some guidelines on how, so that the assessments are being made consistent. The competent person can really only be interpreting the guidance if it's being done consistently. So I think having those guidelines put together would be the aid for the competent person to be making those assessments. Maybe one other question for you as well, is one concern I have about why I think some guidance is necessary here as well, is to make sure that we are being consistent of the definition of time. If you were to relax the principles behind reasonable expectation of when something's going to happen for this commodity, for actually this type of process for acquisition of a commodity, it wouldn't be consistent with other commodities that a company had. So it's a risk of having a portfolio that wasn't balanced to risk.
Yeah. It is a general guideline that about eventual might mean up to 50 years. In my experience, it's generally not interpreted that way in most cases. There are some deposits where you can have that sort of future, but they're not that common. I think, and in retrospect, I think that's probably a guideline that could have been written a bit more tightly, because it does leave quite a bit of scope for almost abuse of the guideline. But my experience has been that so far I haven't seen it abused, not deliberately anyway. Yeah.
We'll do one last question, then
Yeah, just anyway, I'll stand back a bit. So, just one thing about polymetallic nodules is, well, two things about it. The first thing is it's a tonnage game. So, it's all about moving tons. So, it's a lot like a bulk commodity in many ways. The second thing is it's an immense resource. There's enough nodules there to keep the world supplied with a lot of metals for hundreds of years. So a long-term view is something that has to be built into an appreciation of eventual economic extraction. Otherwise, people will only go to report resources for the next 5 years or the next 10 years. And so like other bulk commodities, when you've got a massive iron ore belt or coal basin, you need to give the prospective investor an idea of how long or how big this thing truly is. So these long time frames are unfortunately part of the equation here. And it's not really directly related to the actual metals. The metals are just what come in that tonnage business.
to say that you shouldn't be disclosing the volumes. It's just you need to make sure they're being consistent elsewhere. Absolutely, you got to do the long time frame. In the petroleum industry, we have things that are 100 years as well. So yeah, I fully appreciate that as well. Matthew, I hope you don't mind. Would you mind if we delayed you till after lunch? Is that okay? All right. I think we're going to break for lunch because it is time now. I know they're ready out there. So could we take just 45 minutes for lunch and try make sure we're back and started by 1:30? 1:30, yeah, the absolute latest. Okay, thank you very much.
Competent person. Pat actually covered a lot of what I was actually intending on saying, so I'm actually going to try and change my talk up a little bit. I'll use the same slides, but I'll speak a little bit differently and just more speak from experience and try to talk about some examples of what I had to do as a competent person. Term competent person, competent. I think I'm competent. I hope I'm competent. And person, I'm obviously a person. I think I am. Might have to look twice in the mirror. But the term competent person actually has a rather strict term in context with the code. I'm going to loosely call it the code. And when I mean the code, I'm talking more about the Crisco template, the NI 43101, the JORC 2012. They're the two codes that I'm actually quite familiar with. I've been spending pretty much the last 2 decades doing resource estimation under those two codes, so I'm fairly familiar with that and familiar with what a competent person actually is supposed to be and supposed to do. The Crisco code, as Pat quite nicely alluded to, has 3 primary principles. The first principle being transparency. Now, what does transparency actually mean? From a competent person's perspective, that's about being, providing enough information that the person reading the document can understand what you're talking about. Okay, being clear, clean and concise with what you're talking about. Being balanced. Balanced, what I'm talking about here is providing information that is both good and bad. If you're talking about exploration results, you don't want to exclude the bad situation where you've gone out on your boat and you've dropped a few box cores over it and they failed to pick up nodules. You explain that in your report. That's balanced reporting. Because you don't want to give the perception that everything's rosy, everything's good. Because the investor might look at it and go, oh wow, fantastic, we've got this deposit that's just perfect. When in fact, it may actually not be. You need to be unambiguous. That is, not trying to mean something else than what you're actually saying. So you want to be clear about that. You want to state exactly what you mean and be clear about it. I mentioned clear quite a few times, so there it is. Being clear, concise and accurate. Not misleading. So you don't want to be talking about something like a red herring that has absolutely nothing to do with the resource, and yet you spend most of your time talking about it. You're misleading the investor along a path that doesn't make any sense, doesn't matter. So you don't mislead the investor in your public reporting. The next one is materiality. This is probably another very important principle, and one that sometimes gets a little bit misunderstood. It means all relevant information that somebody, the third party reading the report, can understand the report and expects, or what they expect to be in the report. So in the industry, there are certain things that go into a report that investors look for. If you don't include that, such as like a description of the geology or a description of the method that you use for collecting your samples, or what you've done about your QA/QC, if you don't include that, then you are not following the principles of materiality. You're leaving out points that should be there, that the investor expects. It's about judgment, and sometimes that judgment can be very, very, very difficult to do. You can look at something and go, is this material or isn't material?
I don't know. If you're asking yourself and telling yourself that you're not sure about whether it's material or not, then put it in. It's not if in doubt, leave out. It's more if in doubt, put it in. You know, it's about transparency as well. So if you're not sure about it, put it in, state it. Unless, for instance, if it happens to be like trade secrets, there are some, particularly under the NI 43-101, that allows, if you have trade secrets, then you don't necessarily have to give all the details. You just have to be transparent enough to allow the investor to understand where you're coming from and what you're doing and how you're reporting your resources and reserves. You've got to include or think about how it's going to affect the public. If I include this material or not include this material in the report, how is it going to affect the perceptions of the third party? How are they going to read and understand the report? If you leave something out, they may actually get the wrong impression about what the resource is about. Okay. Affecting value. This is probably one of the biggest parts from materiality. Give you an example. If company X has, say, 50 resources, and they're reporting resources for one of those deposits, and they're talking about an assumption of a particular parameter for that estimation of resources, and if it's out by a certain percentage, it could mean that they've got no resource, or they have a resource. So talk about a binary selection, so 100% resource or 0% resource. For that company, let's say that percentage change is 100%, and in value terms, it's say $1 million. That company has 50 deposits, each worth several $100 million, and total value probably over, let's just say, $1 billion. So if that resource is 100% wrong, it doesn't matter to the company. It's not material to the company. Now, if another company, say company Y, has that same resource, and that's the only resource they have, then in this instance, it is extremely material, because it means, if that parameter is right, they've got a resource. If that parameter is right, they've got a resource. If it's wrong, they don't. And if it's wrong, they could be in serious trouble financially. So materiality is not just about the information that gets, it's not about the information that gets put into the resource, it's also about what the materiality to the company. So you've got to think about those aspects as well. And although it's not described in the code, it's sort of more or less implicit when we do the work. The third is competency, or competence. And this is where the competent person actually comes into it. And this is a very, very important aspect of the code. Without the competent person, basically, the code would not work. The competent person has to be qualified. Now, qualified is a relative term, and it's related to the role of the competent person. So, for instance, for me, I'm a competent person. I think I am. I hope I am. But I'm a competent person in relation to mineral resource estimation. That is, I'm qualified to do mineral resource estimates. I'm a qualified geologist. I've been working in the minerals industry for nearly 2 decades, been doing resource estimates for nearly as long as that, and I've gained that experience. But am I qualified to be acting as a competent person for, say, the mineral reserves? The answer is no, I can't, because I'm not qualified. I don't have a mining engineering background. But I might actually be able to do the mining aspects of it. I might be able to do, say, scheduling or something like that, but it doesn't mean that I can sign off on that. I might be able to do the work, but then I'd need a competent person to be supervising that work and then sign off on it. So it doesn't stop me from doing the work, I just need somebody else to help. The experience. It comes down to the experience. And as Pat said, you do need 5 years. And I've got another slide that covers that. Experience is an important aspect of competence, because without the experience, you don't know what you're actually doing. You might have gone and listened into a lecture and found out, oh, I know how to do resource estimation. Been told using ordinary kriging, for instance, is a good way to go. But without the experience of actually applying that, you don't realise what can actually go wrong. So you can apply it and get it woefully wrong. So that's where the experience comes into it. Membership. That's also a very, very important aspect of it. Without membership, you're not a competent person. Membership is basically, you've got to be a member of any of the registered professional organisations listed by, say, the British Columbia Securities Commission or the ASX. They have maintained a list of organisations which, if you're a member of one of those, then you can qualify as a competent person or qualified person. Doesn't mean that you will or are, but it just means that the chances of you becoming a competent person is much higher. And for instance, for me, I'm a member of the Australian Institute of Geoscientists. That's on the list of both the ASX and also the NI 43101. In fact, it's also listed for the SAMRAC and probably a couple of other codes as well. The reason why AIG is on a lot of the listings is because of the membership requirements to actually become a member of the AIG. You actually have to have 5 years industry experience before you can even be a member. Now, a lot of other organisations don't require that. In fact, like the AusIMM recently got knocked off the list for the NI 43101. In fact, they bumped up the membership grade to fellow, principally because they allowed the membership requirements to get into the AusIMM is less than the AIG. You didn't need the 5 years experience. And in the AIG, you also need 2 people to vet your CV. They actually need to know you, need to have been worked with you, and actually are also members of the AIG. So it makes it really quite difficult to become a member. And it also means that the competent person, if you're a part of the AIG, you know that they've got 5 years experience. You know that they are qualified to be an ACT as a QP, simply because of the membership requirements for that organisation. It's not necessarily the case for all of them. I don't speak for some of the others that are listed. But yeah, when we were doing the TOML report, I needed 2 other competent persons to sign off on the aspects of exploration, because I wasn't competent enough to sign off on that. I needed a couple of competent people to bridge that gap. And in order to bridge that gap, we brought in 2 others, Charles Morgan and David Banning. And they had a wealth of experience in exploration, in the nodule sampling. They knew what went on, they knew how it was sampled, they could actually bring that to the table. But they didn't have the membership. And so we had to actually help them get that membership and got them through the AIG. But it was a difficult process. So it's not easy, but it can be done. The membership also comes with a code of ethics. So when you become a member, you've actually got to abide by that code of ethics. And it's quite a long list. I couldn't parrot off exactly what that code of ethics is, but generally being, behave appropriately and professionally, and not to actually try and mislead or to do fraudulent activity. And if you did that, then you'd be ejected out of the AIG or whatever other organisation you're in. And as a result, you wouldn't actually be able to work in the industry again, because you'd also be blacklisted to some degree. Companies looking at, well, you did bad things, you got ejected out, we're not using you. And as I alluded to before, it can be more than one competent person. And in general, it actually is more than one competent person. The only time when you have just the one is early on in the exploration phase, where you might have a resource, but that competent person can also sign off on the data. That doesn't always happen, and a lot of the cases we work in the minerals industry, and particularly reporting under the JORC code. And what we do is we get a competent person from the company to also act as part to sign off on the exploration of data. So they sign off on the exploration of data aspects, because as a competent person they are more familiar with it. We come along and do the resource estimates, but we also do the checks and balances on that data. So we don't necessarily take them, the competent person from the company's word for it. We actually do additional checks. Now, the competent person must take into consideration both transparency and materiality. That's a very important triangle there, because they're the three main principles of the code. But the competent person should always keep in mind, am I being transparent? Am I including everything that's material to this estimate in the public report? Am I being clear and concise? These are the things that you've always got to consistently keep thinking about. You can never get away from those three principles. So who is a competent person? Well, here I am, I'm one, at least. I've been a competent person for iron ore, for nickel, for copper, for gold, and now nodules. So I'm a competent person for mineral resource estimation, not for the mining side, and I'm not for exploration. But at least I've got quite a few commodities that I can sign off on. But I'll just go through the actual meaning of a competent person as listed in the framework, in the code, that Pat actually briefly touched on. A competent person is a mineral industry professional. That is somebody who actually works in the profession. It's not a scientist. It's not a geochemist that works in the library. It's somebody who works in the mining industry. Okay? So it's just a key point. It's somebody who's actually working in the industry. It's somebody who has that recognised professional organisation. They're a member, as I alluded to before. And that's really important. If you don't have that, you are not a competent person. And usually the various regulations that are ratified, the various Frisco Code and under, say, JORC or NI 43101, they have their own list of organisations which you should be a member. And if you're not a member of any of those on that list, you are not a competent person or a qualified person that can actually sign off on the resources for that jurisdiction. Now, in case in point, the Charles and Davey were members of professional organisations, but that organisation was not listed in the Canadian system, so they couldn't actually act as QP through their organisation that they were members on, so they had to go somewhere else. Competent person must have, and this is, you can't get around this, you must have this. You must have the 5 years experience. You can't have 2 years, 3 years, or 4 years and 6 months. It's got to be at least 5 years experience. And now that experience is in the role or in the type of mineralisation that you're addressing. Although this can be a little bit flexible. The code sort of allows you to be able to cross your experience from one commodity to another. As long as the type of deposit that you did in one, like the gold, is similar to, say, for instance, you're working in copper. So you've got to be able to sort of compare and make sure that that experience is very similar to what you're trying to act as competent person in. The main point is actually the activity in which you're performing your role. As I said to you before, you want to be a competent person in, say, you're choosing to be a mineral resource estimation. You need to have the experience in the mineral resource estimation. You can't try to do mineral resource estimation if all you've got is 5 years in the exploration and data. Doesn't work. So the more important aspect is actually the 5 years experience in the activity under which you're actually acting as CP. Okay? So if you're doing mineral resource estimation, 5 years experience in mineral resource estimation. If you're doing the exploration side of it, it's 5 years in exploration and sampling. If you're doing the environmental, it's 5 years in the environmental side of things, legal, so on. Again, appropriate membership and appropriate qualifications. So you might know how to do mineral resource estimation, but you're not a geologist. So you're not familiar with interpretation, and domaining, and statistical and variographic analysis, for instance. But you might have experience in actually performing that, but you're not qualified. Now, that's not necessarily stated in the code. It's generally considered a requirement. So you don't get a geologist to do mineral reserves. You don't get a mining engineer to do resources. You don't get an environmental scientist to do exploration, for instance. You get the right qualified person for the right job. Now, before I go on, I actually just want to mention that a competent person is not your enemy. Somebody is there to try and help you to extract the value out of your deposit. They're there to try and get the deposit estimated into a particular category, hopefully indicated, preferably sometimes measured. So that allows you to perform economic assessments on that estimate. So we're there to help. We're there to guide you to find, and we're there to identify gaps in your information or your data. You know, John knows quite well. You know, sometimes I'll get there, he goes, "Can I get this indicated?" No. How can I get it to indicate it? Well, you need to do this. You need to make sure that your sampling's close enough, and you need to make sure that you've got your QA/QC. Now, I'd tell you all straight up right now that no one here would probably have indicated resources unless they have the appropriate QA/QC available. That's the one major problem that I had when I was trying to estimate the resources for Tom. Got the data, looked at it, well, had no QA/QC. What were the samples done by? What was the method? Box core or free-fall grabs? No idea. Location information on the certainty of the locations? No idea. How was the locations measured? No idea. And so on and so on. There was so little information on the data that I really struggled to even get to inferred. The problem was the data did not have the backup information. And I'll stress it to everyone here, make sure that you do collect that information and record it, please, because it really does make a big difference to whether a CP like myself will come in and say, no, you don't actually have a resource. You can't get it to infer because that data, you know, it's just numbers. There's nothing backing it up. And that's a very important aspect for resource estimation. Without that, I can't help you. All I can do is then come in and say, okay, we lack this information. What can we do to verify this data? Now, I struggled with Tommel. I thought about this question for quite a long time, and it was an issue that bugged me for weeks. And it was something I knew there was a solution to, and I made sure I just kept thinking about it and trying working out how can I get around the fact that I don't have the metadata for the data. I don't have that information. Now, the way I took it was basically, I looked at the CCZ as one deposit. Not each individual contractor's area as individual deposits. I treated the whole CCZ as one deposit. And that makes a big difference in how I verify the data. Because then I could actually take the data and split it up into all the different contractors. All the different contractors. You know, there was at least 6 or 7 data sets there. Now, each individual contractor I knew or assumed that they used different collecting methods, different assaying methods. Everything about their sampling and assaying program may be a little bit different, not always the same. They'd use a different lab, for instance. So I took that and thought, well, okay, I can utilise that assumption and then compare all of the data, split it up and compare it with each other. And what that allows you to do is basically treats it like twin data pairing. You know, you can actually compare 2 different data sets and get an indication of the accuracy of it. And luckily, a lot of the results were very similar. The distributions were remarkably similar. The variance on the assays is very low, which gave me confidence that the data was suitable for purpose. It was something I had to argue with the regulators. We had a few issues on that. They sort of thought, okay, no, you don't have that. You don't actually have a resource. But we thought, no, hang on, we do, because we can compare these data sets. So even though you might not have the information, there are ways of going about verifying the data and making sure that you can get a resource estimate. So that's what, as a competent person, we do. We do that all the time. We try to think about, okay, what are we missing? What do we need? How do we actually get around what we're missing while maintaining the integrity, the transparency, the materiality, and ensuring that we're doing the estimate to best practice. And it's not always easy. It can actually take some time to actually figure out. But the question I'll ask any of you is, are you a competent person? So think hard about that. Can you act as a competent person? What role could you be acting as a competent person? What would you need to do to become a competent person? Is it all that I need to do is just actually go and join a membership? Go and find somebody who actually is and start that process so you can become a competent person. The colour doesn't quite work on the screen, sorry about that. Here I put in for estimating mineral resources. That's just one aspect of the role. Now for a project, there are a whole swag of different roles that a competent person can take on. You've got legal, environmental, social, you've got mining, geology, you've got exploration, you've probably got marketing, metallurgy, process engineering, engineering design, maybe for the collector, and probably a few others as well. So there's actually quite a large number of competent people that are required for a project. And in the NI 43-101, which to some degree is not too bad because they prescribe a particular technical document. And that technical document has sections for each area that would be regarded as necessary as competent people. So that have the legal, environmental, marketing, and so on. And in generating the first report, generally you fill in the geology, the exploration, maybe a mineral resource. And then there's only one technical report. That technical report keeps getting updated as you actually get more information. So then if you do a mineral reserve, that mineral reserve goes into the section for mineral reserves and you update your technical report so you only have one technical report. So all the information related to your project is in one report and you keep updating it. And sometimes you feel like you're repeating yourself and putting the same information out, but you're required to. So the technical report needs to stand on its own. So you take the original one and you'll just add in an extra section and you reissue it, and so on. And so if you do a preliminary economic assessment, after you've done your resource estimate, you'll fill in those sections on metallurgy, processing, mining engineering, scheduling, and so on, in a fairly general basis. And as Pat alluded to, it's basically a self-assessment. It's up to you to decide if you are the competent person. No one else. You can ask the regulator, and I've actually done this. They'll send a letter back saying, it's up to you. Simple as that. So you need to make that choice. And it's not an easy choice. It's a choice that takes time. And in the case of the Tommel one, I was sitting there and I got asked, can you act or do you want to do this resource estimate for nodules? And I thought about that for quite a while because I'd actually been involved in the deep sea SMS, the Solwara project. So I'm familiar with the Nautilus and I was familiar with the deep sea projects. And so I had to think, okay, what aspects of being a competent person is related to this project? I'm qualified. I've got 5 years experience, minimum, a lot more than that in resource estimation. I've got experience in the commodities nickel, copper, cobalt, yes. But what I didn't have was the direct experience in the deposit. That was the hard part, to bridge the gap. And one way to get past that is actually to have other competent people come on board, as I said, Dave Banning and Charles. They helped with me understanding what was required or what went on and how the deposit was sampled, the geology of the deposit, the differences, the similarities, and so on, and what issues I needed to be aware of when I'm estimating resource. So they proved to be quite valuable. So they helped me bridge that gap. So the thing is, if you're not quite there with your being a competent person, you ask the same questions. Can I get somebody else that can help bridge that gap? There may be someone that can, there may not be, but you've got to try. You've got to look for that. If you can find somebody, fantastic, you can go forward. Now bear in mind that even though you make that self-assessment, it's up to the peers to also keep you honest. And normally they don't necessarily call you out on it, but they can, and sometimes they do. So you've got to be aware of that. Even though you say, oh, I'm a competent person, you've got to be aware, well, okay, do my peers think I'm also a competent person? So in the case of the TOML stuff, I actually went around and asked my peers in Golder, I asked, well, do you think I've got sufficient experience to cover this? And the answer was yes. And in a lot of cases, these are people that have got a lot more experience than I have, that have been in the industry almost 3 decades, 30 odd years. I asked at least 2, 3, 4 people the same question. Do you think I am a competent person for this role, for this deposit? And they looked at it and went, okay, yeah, you got the commodity experience, you got the experience, but you don't have the direct deposit experience, but you do have experience in bulk commodities, which I did with the iron ore and the nickel laterites. So we utilised that as well to help bridge that gap. So you just got to think about what's needed and how I can actually bridge that gap. Okay? This is a very, very important aspect of it, and it's one that actually almost stopped us from issuing the technical report for TOML, the site visit. Now, it was a very, very difficult aspect to cover from the NI 43-101. NI 43-101 requires that you have to have visited the site. They used to actually specify a 6-month period, that you had to visit the site within 6 months. But luckily, they actually dropped that requirement just as we were reporting the technical report. So they had actually taken that out, which is to our benefit, actually. So what we actually did was got somebody who actually had been to that site, but 20, 25 years ago. It didn't matter because they didn't actually specify any more of the time frame. And we actually put some qualifying words around why we thought that the site visit was still relevant, because we knew that the geological process was so slow and long and it would hardly ever change. And basically, if you go to the site, what you're going to do is see that, the ocean, or the sea. There's not much actually to see when you do go to visit the site. So the site visit here, we thought, well, even if I go to site, am I actually going to see anything worth seeing? And the answer in this case, probably not. The site visit, even though it's a prerequisite for NI 43-101, it's actually not requisite for JORC, but under JORC it's an if not, why not? So if you didn't do it, you've got to explain why you didn't do it. But this site visit doesn't necessarily mean that you're actually going to get anything out of it. Because the minerals terrestrial-based site visit, not much to see. What you do normally is you look for the evidence of mineralisation, or in this case, evidence of nodules. So if you go out into the ocean on a little boat, all you're going to do is see water, endless expanse of water. You're not going to see any evidence of nodules, unless you get into a deep submersible and travel 5 kilometres down the bottom of the ocean. I don't think anyone's going to do that. I think there's only one person who's probably travelled down to that depth. And there's only probably one sub that can actually do that. So, looking for evidence of the nodules from a site visit perspective is actually difficult. So what you actually needed to do is be on the boat when you're sampling the nodules. And in the case of TOML, they hadn't had that that plan for a year. And the cost of a cruise, as you're well aware, is pretty expensive. And you don't want to just set up a cruise just to get a competent person out there to see it. Yeah. So the site visit, even though it's prescribed under NI 43-101 as a requisite, it's very difficult. It was very difficult to actually comply with that. And so we struggled for quite some time to actually comply with it, even though we knew, sending me out on a little boat was going to prove nothing. The other aspect of the site visit basically is observing, the sampling. So really, you want to actually have that site visit when you're going out there on a cruise sampling. And in this instance, it's actually very important to consider getting a competent person early on in your exploration phase, even before you're even considering doing a resource estimate, because it could really help with the site visit. It means that the competent person's already been to site, has already observed your sampling, is familiar with that sampling, and can sign off on that sampling. The other aspect of going to site is, I tend to do it a few times, sometimes I don't enjoy doing it, but verifying the data. It's a rather thankless, tedious, boring task. It's one you'd like to give it to somebody else, but it's an essential point, a part of it. And normally most terrestrial-based deposits have their data on site. So when you go visit the site, you actually go and check the data. You go into their data room and have a look at you check 5 to 10% of the data. It's to verify that what you've got in the database is actually what has been recorded in their assay certificates, their physical records of their sampling. So for instance, you track through the data and you just basically randomly pick various records. I've just got a couple of examples. They're just me randomly typing in some numbers as an example. And then you're checking that from the database against the assay certificates and whether they're equal or not. In this case, I've intentionally made sure that they aren't equal. So basically, we identify how many errors are in the database. So if you get 1 or 2 that you found erroneous out of thousands that you've checked, then the database is fairly good. In one instance, I went to a project site for a copper deposit, and I was checking the data, and that data had actually been audited by another consultancy before. So you'd think maybe this data should actually be pretty good. Don't assume, because it wasn't. When I started checking through the data, I realised that the copper was switched with the gold. And so what was in the database was gold for copper and copper for gold. And I also found other instances where in the database it was recorded as parts per million and mixed in with percentage. So, order of magnitude out. And sometimes, generally, what we do is we go and scan through the database, pick the outliers, the worst data, the most extreme data, because we assume that probably they're wrong, and then go and check them against the physicals. In the case of the TOML work, where we didn't actually have any of that, we had absolutely no idea what the error rate was in the database. So please keep hold of that sort of information as well, because it is very important from a competent person's perspective to verify that data. And you need to actually state in the public report that you have verified that data. How much of a percentage of that database have you gone through and checked? At every stage, a competent person must assess suitability of the data. This is critical. In fact, in the NI 43-101, you actually have to state the suitability of it. You have to do that. You have to say at the end of the section on verification of data that, for instance, this data has been verified and is suitable for purpose for mineral resource estimation. Or the other is, no, the data is not suitable and we can't use it. And we were almost at that point with the TOML work. We were almost at that point where, no, we can't use it because we can't verify it. In which case I would have had to have put in the statement that this data is not suitable for purpose. But we worked out other ways of verifying it. So you have to include it in your public report. You have to include descriptions of the methods of the sampling, and procedures, and always remember transparency. The next aspect from a competent person's perspective is the data. That's the most important part of a mineral resource estimate because it's what goes into the estimate. It's what you're basing your estimate on. You've got to check the quality assurance, quality control information. And again, I'll harp on this until the cows come blue. Basically, you need the information, you need the quality control. And it's a little bit different than normal scientific practices. You might take a few samples and check samples, but quality control, quality assurance data for resource estimation of what the minerals industry expects is quite substantial. We expect check samples, we expect field duplicates, we expect lab assay repeats, and so on. We expect a blank assay standards going in, we expect normal standards going in to check the veracity of the data. If you don't have that, please start doing it now because you need to have that data verified by a competent person. You need to describe your methods of how you collect that data, how you crush your nodules, how you measure moisture, how you measure the weight of the nodules, how you even calibrate your machine that you use to weigh the nodules. You need to describe the assaying method, the lab, how it was crushed at the lab, what method, the assaying actual method that the lab used, what was the procedures that the lab used to control quality, and so on. You need to describe your procedures, field procedures. This is how we do the sampling. And the storage of the data. You need to understand that even though you collect the data, it can actually become useless if you don't store it correctly. Storing it in an Excel spreadsheet is insufficient because the columns can be switched and parts of the spreadsheet can be sorted independent of each other, and you lose confidence in the data. So storing it in an Access database, for instance, is one starting point. You'd also need to consider maintenance of the data. Who looks after it? Who protects it? Who manages it? The verification of data, as I've expressed before, and security. Security in the NI 43-101 is actually a very big issue. You need to understand and document how the sample passes from the boat to the lab and every step in between, and you have to understand who can access those samples, keeping the number of people limiting the number of people access to those samples improves security. It's all about fraudulent activity. Some people can come along and actually salt the sample. They do that in gold, copper. It can happen and has happened, and that's the reason why the NI 43-101 has come along and said, no, we need to know the security procedures. How do you actually protect the sample between when you collect it and when you assay it? The competent person has to follow the code. You're there as part of the code because it's written in the code, so you have to follow the code. You have to follow and go through table 1 of the Crisco template, chalk table. The competent person, in this case, mineral resources, supervises or estimates mineral resources or reserves. So the competent person doesn't actually have to perform the estimate. They just have to be there to supervise that estimate. Okay, so sometimes the company might estimate the resource, but we can come in and do an audit, check the resource, check the data, check everything, and go, yep, okay, and we sign off on it. Competent person classifies the mineral resource and all reserves. Company doesn't do that. Company representative doesn't do that. It's the competent person. It's the decision of the competent person, and it's solely up to the competent person to make that choice. A lot of the times the companies will try to say, we want indicated. The competent person will push back and say, no, it just got inferred. Because at the end of the day, it is the competent person who takes responsibility for that mineral resource estimate. Not the company, It's the competent person. It's the person who's signing off on it. And so you have to actually take that responsibility seriously, because it is a legal responsibility. Because not only can you get kicked out of your membership, but you could also get taken to court. You could also find yourself in jail. Classification, in this case, let's say we've decided it's inferred. Doing the classification, actually, it's not an easy process. It can actually take quite a long time. It can take sometimes longer than the actual estimation process. The reason for that is you've actually got to understand all aspects of that estimate, the risk involved, what parameters can change and how those parameters can affect the estimate, the assumptions that you've applied to it and whether the confidence on those assumptions is adequate for a particular level. You need to take into consideration all the modifying factors. You need to also not report everything. This is a distinction. You're not reporting everything. You're reporting, say for instance, you have a deposit and some of that deposit is categorised as an environmental reserve. No chance ever of being able to mine it. You can't report it. Even you might like to, but you can't, unfortunately. So that comes to the term, is it a mineral reserve? So the first choice in classifying it is, okay, have I actually got a mineral resource as defined by the code? Because bear in mind, as a competent person, we have to follow the code. Whether it's JORC 2012 or NI 43-101, we still have to follow the code and also the regulations wrapped around that code, as well as, say, the ASX listing rules and so on. So in this sense, of course, most deposits fall into that category. So the next part of the description is such form, grade, or quality and quantity that these are reasonable. That there are reasonable prospects for eventual economic extraction. And as Pat pointed out, it's that eventual economic extraction that you actually have to take into consideration before you classify it as a mineral resource. So if you know, for instance, with gold and it's refractory, and you know that there is no way that you're going to get the gold out, then you can't classify it as a resource. You don't have a resource. Even though you might have fantastic gold grades, if you can't get it out, forget it. Same with nodules. If you know you've got, say, rare earths in there, but you know absolutely unequivocally that you know that the processing route to get the rare earths out is not there yet, and probably never will be, then again, you can't classify it as a resource. And again, this is the responsibility of the CP. Okay? Not the company, the CP makes that choice. And it must be stated in the public report. There must be a statement in there saying that the competent person believes that there is reasonable prospects for economic extraction for these reasons, A, B, C, D. And also, you've got to understand the location. The estimate is known, estimated or interpreted from specific geological evidence. You can't make it up. You can't say, oh, we've got a copper resource sitting on the moon. Yeah, okay. How do you know that? So it's got to be done from physical evidence, the nodule samples. I don't know whether video actually falls under physical evidence or not at this moment, because maybe the regulators might accept it, might not, because video and remote sensing methods detect nodule percent coverage, and then from there you've actually got to then determine nodule abundance. It's not a direct sampling of nodule abundance, so it's not necessarily physical evidence. Yes, there's nodules there, but does it relate to abundance? Maybe not. We're actually using a formula to derive that, and that's not necessarily sampling. So when you come to classifying the resource, there's a number of aspects that you've got to consider. First, geology, the continuity of the mineralisation. the dimensions, basically. We know that the CCZ is actually massive, so the dimensions aren't an issue. The domains, in the case of the TOML, we considered the CCZ as one domain, one massive big domain. Domaining for resource estimation is a little bit different to domaining from a scientific perspective. We're only interested in domains of continuity of grade and tonnes. If you have 3 different facies, and they all have the same grade, it's one domain. And continuity, this is the aspect that the regulators we had nearly had heart attacks over the phone. They struggle with the concept of 20 kilometre spacing. It is a very long way from in respect to mineral resources, and I'll explain that in my second talk. But 20 kilometres, a lot can happen in 20 kilometres, and so the regulators had a real big trouble with that, but we actually explained to them that, yes, in relation to the size and dimension of the deposit, it's actually not that large. We also got to consider the data, as I mentioned, QA, QC, quality, and the verification, the security, and so on of the data. We also got to consider the modelling techniques, how we actually did our estimate. We've got to state how we did that estimate. The code doesn't prescribe how we do the estimate, it's up to us. We're the CP, we make that choice. We can choose whether we use multiple indicator kriging, ordinary kriging, inverse distance, nearest neighbour, so on, or we even just take the global mean if we choose. We've got to determine relative accuracy. In the code recently, that's starting to become more of a bigger component to it. In NI 43-101, it's a much stronger requirement than under JORC 2012, but it's basically stating how accurate you think that estimate is. Generally, that usually means that you'd have to perform conditional simulations to understand the relative accuracy. You also have to describe the method, of course. Being transparent, you've got to describe how you've actually come to your conclusions. And also all those modifying factors, and there's quite a lot of them. And I've mentioned a few of those: the mining, processing, the metallurgy, the environmental, legal, marketing, social, government, and so on. A competent person needs to actually understand each of those modifying factors. They don't have to be a competent in each of them, they just need to understand whether there's environmental regulations that could kill the project. They've got to understand the governmental situation, whether the government is going to say, no, you haven't got a resource. You've got to understand that. Even though you're not competent in it, you've still got to take that into account. A competent person compiles a technical report. You must consider table 1 of the code, and it's an if not, why not prospect, so you've got to describe everything. If not, why not? Transparency. Materiality, it's always there, you can't get away from it. Transparency, materiality, just keep saying that to yourself. And statements, the competent person statements, there's quite a few of those, and I've got examples. Well, first, the sign off, basically, you've got to put your signature to your resource, to the technical report. And under NI 43-101, you've actually got to sign the report and submit it to CEDA. The competent person statements, basically, it's a bad colour, should choose a different colour. Example, one of those you could actually grab the TOML technical report and see the example of the statement made by the competent person. It's basically me saying that I'm a competent person, I'm a member of the AIG, and I have sufficient experience to qualify as a competent person. You've got to make that statement. And the consent. A company can't actually release the information without the consent of the competent person. And basically you can find examples of that in the TOML report. Basically there's consents well, normally we provide the consents and they provide that on CEDA, not necessarily with the document, but every time TOML releases a statement on resources, they have to get me to sign off on it. Role of the competent person, I'll just run through this quickly. Just to sum up, follow the code, being transparent, material, compile a technical report, suitability of the data at every stage, consider every modifying factor, and observe. The competent person actually has to observe collection of the data, sampling, and so on. And even at times we go to the assay lab to observe the lab preparing the assays. So it's actually a really good idea to get the competent person on board early on so that they can actually observe those things. And they've also got to consider risks, all risks. And sometimes you don't necessarily identify all of them. It's hard to identify all of them. Sometimes after you've done the resource estimate and classified, you go, oh, actually there's another little risk there. It's not material, but it's still a risk. Gap analysis. This is somewhere where you might not have a resource, but I can come along and go, okay, what do you need to get to a resource? How many samples? The sample spacing. Are you missing QA/QC? What do you need? I can help with that. And a competent person generally does that as part of the resource classification and estimation. They'll have an understanding of what's missing. They go, okay, you've got inferred, but if you want indicated, this is what you need to do. Responsibilities. Resource estimate, you sign off on it, you take responsibility for it. The technical report, you sign off on it, you take responsibility for all the content within that technical report. The public statements, you take responsibility for that as well. And membership. You've got to make sure that your membership's up to date, so that's your responsibility. No one else tells you that you need to maintain that membership. You've got to do it yourself. And consider the if not, why not principle. So basically, when you're compiling a technical report, you've got to go, well, okay, I don't have this, so why not? You've got to describe why not. If I haven't gone to the site, done the site visit, why not? Why haven't I gone? And so on. And trust. This is the final word of the day. And this is probably the reason why I've done this. I can trust this estimate. Yeah, the competent person actually is the one that gives the trust. And the trust also comes from performing the estimate to best practices. Oops. Independence. Now the code, the Crisco code doesn't actually state that it needs to be independent, but it's actually, the industry these days is actually going towards more competent people are independent. It builds trust. If you've got a competent person signing off on the resource as part of the company, how do you know that that competent person is actually acting independent of the company and acting in the role of the competent person? They may be controlled by or dictated to by their employers, saying, we want indicated, you give us indicated, you've got no choice. But being independent, the independent, like myself, the consultant will come along and say, no, you've only got inferred, you can't get indicated. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Matthew.
Sorry about the green.
That's all right.
I'll just speak loudly. I'd forgotten how painful that entire process was.
Yes.
So thank you for reminding us of that.
I thought you needed reminding.
Yeah, I think you forget painful things in your life after a while. I guess the key message for the other contractors is I would consider an independent, competent person a bit like a guide, really. I mean, I was overwhelmed by what Matthew went through, and I'd already been through it once before. But it was just so much work, and it's so complicated, and potentially very painful if you have a hostile regulator. But having an experienced, competent person is really like a guide, and then they'll tell you what you have to worry about, and what you don't have to worry about, and that can make your life a lot easier. The other thing you can do is as much work as you can do up front to help the competent person, the better. So if you can prepare your data and make it clean, or help write sections in the report in draft form, that's always a good thing as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I have a very good idea about this concept of competent person. I concern concerned what's the procedure or process of not only to be the CP, but the organization or association who can certify the CP, what kind of association and the member, or what's the procedure and the process of such kind to be such kind of association. I have no idea about it. And the second question is that in general, in what stage that CB competent persons involved in the estimate or provision of estimate of the resources or reserves, specifically in the future for the sea mineral resources.
Yeah, your first part is basically, it's, say for instance the role of the ISA, they're trying to establish a consistent framework for reporting. Now it's also the role of the ISA to then also issue a list of recognised professional organisations that they consider adequate for competent persons. Now, I've spoken to a few people about this, and one of those is that they could actually use the same list that's given by the Toronto Stock Exchange, the NI 43101. That's a good starting point because it's fairly comprehensive, because they've actually gone through the process of looking at each of the organisations and ensuring that, one, do they have appropriate standard of conduct, what's their membership requirements to get in, and they've graded those and looked at it and go, yes, we accept the RIG, we accept the fellow from the AusIMM, we accept those from the Canadian institutes and so on. So they've done a lot of that hard work. So for the ISA, all they would probably need to do is just say, okay, we accept that list and ratify the fact that we will use that list, and as the Canadian system changes that list, we'll change ours according to that. That's one way. The ASX also does the same sort of thing. They go through and list, and typically for each of the excuse me, each of the regulatory frameworks like the Canadian system or the Australian system or the Russians and so on, they'll have at least one organisation from their own country listed on that. Okay. So that's the first part. The second part, regarding the role of the CP, just trying to think of what the second part of the question was. Can you remind me?
In when or in what state?
What state?
Involved in such an estimation.
Yeah. It's always a good, as John alluded to, the role of the CP is essentially like a guide. We're there to help you go from an exploration phase into getting a resource inferred, resource to indicated, and possibly, if you can get to it, resource measured, which in the case of the deep sea nodules, it may be extremely difficult to get to measured because of the requirements there. But it's always a good idea to get at least nominate a lead CP to get involved with the project early on, so they understand the processes, can observe on board your ships, because your cruise is fairly expensive, so you do want to get them early, because they won't necessarily always be available as well. So you identify the competent person that you say, oh, okay, we need to have somebody for the resource estimate, so we'll get somebody up, come on the site visit, and then later on, once we've got all the data, they can then go and do the estimate. So generally, probably slightly before you do the resource estimate at least. Okay. And then sometimes even in the exploration phase.
Great. Thank you very much. I actually think in the interest of time, I think we'll move on to Pat. I think we can cover any other issues if you've got more on these. I think it may fit in with the issues that Pat's going to discover. Thank you very much, Pat.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, well, in the first discussion, I outlined CURSCO and the framework and how that relates to UNFC and those side of things. Now, there is a whole wealth, though, of industry knowledge and guidelines that are there to assist the competent and the qualified persons. So what I'm going to describe now is what's generally called best practices. I think it would be better called good practices, because it's always hard to say something is the best. but the terminology is best practices. So this is a discussion on best practices as it relates to the CRISCO style of reporting. And on this one, I'm presenting on behalf of Deborah McComb, who's the past chair of CRISCO, the past president. And she apologises, but she's in Mongolia as well. And she helped to prepare this presentation. So I'll talk about best practices really under two broad categories, but the first one essentially is what I spoke about already. So it's best practices in the public reporting. Now we're still, if you like, at that almost apex or corner, if you like, of the UNFC, where we're talking about market-related reporting. So I want to emphasise that all I'm talking about here is market-related reporting, or reporting when you're at the commercial end of the spectrum. Then I'll go on to talk about best practice in estimation, classification, and monitoring, because it's very important to recognise that the CRISCO template and the codes and standards that it's based on are all to do with reporting. They are not to do with estimation. The estimation of the resource and the reserve is the responsibility of the competent or the qualified person, as Matthew's just described. And it's a very important distinction to remember that the CRISCO template and the codes are to do with how you report, not how you estimate. However, they do contain a lot of guidance for the competent, the qualified person, and there are other areas where this guidance is provided. I'll then talk about Canada's additional activities in this area, Australia's additional activities. They're the two main countries that have additional areas where they provide guidance to the competent, qualified person, and then other activities in general. And I'll end up with a recommendation at the end of this as well. I won't go over this again because it's already been described. It was really just to remind people what CRISCO is, but I think we had enough of that in the first slide, first presentation. Again, these are the current members. Possible that Mongolia might be creeping towards membership this week. Some of these countries, by the way, the Philippines, for example, does have a CRISCO-style reporting standard. It's just that it's never, as I understand it, hasn't requested at this stage to become a member of CRISCO, but it does have an equivalent standard. I believe Indonesia may have as well. So just to summarise really from my first talk, best practices in public reporting, they're represented by each of the CRISCO-style reporting standards. The JORC Code, National Instrument 4311, that encapsulates CIN, SAMRIC, and so on. The main purpose of those standards is to provide a minimum standard for reporting, public reporting of exploration results, resources and reserves. Ensure public reports contain all the information. This is really a repetition of what Matthew's already said. And that they're underpinned by the qualified, the competent person system. Should also clarify just when Matthew was talking about the technical report and what's required under that, he's very specifically talking about the Canadian system. Australia doesn't have an equivalent system to the Canadian technical report system, but it has introduced a requirement to report against Table 1, which I'll mention in a moment, publicly on, as Matthew has just said, the if not, why not principle that came into the 2012. So even though we can talk about a technical report that's required, it's not required under each of the CRISCO standards necessarily. It can differ from country to country. Okay, so getting on to best practices in estimation, classification and monitoring. It's achieved really in four broad ways. One is Table 1 that is in the CRISCO template and is in each of the reporting standards and codes, with the exception of Canada. the CIM, and I'll come to the reason for that in a moment. And in fact, the reason is that Canada has developed separate best practice guidelines. These are on its the CIM website, and I'll describe those in a little bit of detail. But that's why Canada doesn't have Table 1 sitting inside the CIM standards. Another way of supporting best practice in industry is to support industry production of monographs or compilations of peer-reviewed technical papers on good practice in resource and reserve estimation. That is the way that Australia has gone. It hasn't set up separate best practice guidelines along the Canadian lines. Instead, it has supported the production of technical papers in monographs that are available to all. Then there's also a general body of industry experience and technical papers that aren't necessarily part of the systems described here, but they're available to everybody through various industry conferences, technical sessions, workshops, and so on. Now, I apologise for how crowded these next couple of slides are going to be, but in some ways I've left it like this to emphasise the point that Table 1 in these standards has a lot of guidance in it for the competent or the qualified person. So this and the next slide summarises Table 1 in the Crisco template. They're subdivided into 5 general categories: sampling techniques and data, reporting of exploration results, estimation and reporting of mineral resources, estimation and reporting of mineral ore reserves, and in the Crisco template there is a separate section on the estimation and reporting of diamond and gemstone deposits. And under each of these categories we then have a series of headings. I'm not going to go through all of these, so don't worry. For example, we have sampling techniques, drilling techniques, drill sampling recovery, logging, sub-sampling techniques, etc., etc., all sitting under sampling techniques. And each of these in the template has a series of bullet points that are essentially memory joggers or reminders of things you should consider when you're thinking about the sampling techniques, things that are important to consider. The template doesn't tell you exactly how to do any of this, but it tells you these are the aspects that are important and you must take into account. And the same with, if you like, the sampling techniques and data underpin everything. They underpin the reporting of exploration results, the reporting of resources, the reporting of reserves. So each of these categories, if you like, supports the following one as well. So then we get to the reporting of exploration results. There's a whole series of bullet points of subheadings here, and each of them in the template has a series of bullet points that give you more information about issues to consider when you're reporting and estimating. And so on with the estimation of mineral resources, the estimation of mineral reserves, and diamond deposits. So you can see that we refer a lot in the Crisco style standards to Table 1, and this is why. Each one of these standards contains Table 1 other than the Canadian, but they have a wealth of guidance information for the competent or the qualified person. However, how the competent, the qualified person acts on those guidance points is up to his or her judgment and experience. Okay, look, turning to Canada, I'm going to concentrate on Canada and Australia, or Australasia, because really they are the two dominant reporting standards in the world that, on which Crisco is based. JORC was the first one, came out in 1989, as I said, so it's stood the test of time for 25 years. 43101, the first version came out, I think, in about 2001, 2002, something along those lines. Possibly earlier. Sorry, I'm wrong there. They came out about 1997, 1998. For those who know anything about the mining industry, land-based mining, there was a major scandal in the world called the Bre-X, or the Busang scandal. And I can see some nodding going on. And that was an incredible, it's worth reading if you don't know anything about it. Just go on Google and look it up. It was an incredible scandal where the samples were salted with gold, apparently by the geologists on the site, although it was never proved. And it created a stock market phenomenon in Canada that resulted in the share price rocketing upwards. And when it was found to all be falsified, the share price rocketed downwards, and people made a fortune or lost a fortune, and apparently the chief geologist fell out of a helicopter, and various other things happened. Anyway, that's a sideline, but that boosted the finalization of 43101. It was given an imperative at that time, because that sort of thing in the minerals industry, if that happens in the industry and you lose the confidence of the markets, it has a huge impact on the minerals industry, and it did in this case. It took years for it to recover. Funding was just not available for mineral deposits and prospects during that time. So 43101 is a Canadian legal document. It encapsulates the CIN, standard definitions for resources and reserves. And Matthew's described it pretty well, what you have to do under National Instrument 43101. It probably is the toughest regime in the world, the Canadian regime. The regulators are not easy people to persuade. So the fact that Golder was able to persuade them is testament to their work and the persuasive powers. You can read the slides as to what 43101 does. It's based on three sort of principles. There's a qualified person, which is the same as the competent person, except the qualified person has a lot more responsibilities than the competent person. Standards and best practices, and the technical report, which Matthew has described very well. Now, these are the best practice guidelines that the CIM, Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy and Petroleum, has produced to support the CIM standards and definitions, and to support National Instrument 43101. The instrument encourages qualified persons to comply with these guidelines. It doesn't insist, because they are guidelines, they're not mandatory. But they do contain a lot of very good advice on, again, things you should consider. Again, it's not a recipe book for how you do everything. It doesn't describe, for example, how you do geostatistical resource estimates. It doesn't describe exactly how you might do sampling from a drill rig, but it does give you a lot of guidance as to the things that are important in those issues. So this is where I think that eventually the ISA or this body could look at developing best practice guidelines for seabed nodules. So the ones that CIM has are for resources and reserves estimation, exploration, mineral processing, valuation, and I believe there are others as well that I've missed out here. So the CIM has been very active in producing best practice guidelines. In Australia, they took a different approach. They encouraged the publication of industry monographs so they commissioned papers from recognized experts, I guess you'd say, in their fields, under certain categories. So that's the latest monograph that came out, I think last year, or in fact earlier this year. It's called Monograph 30. Table of contents is shown on the left, and as you can see, it covers everything we've been talking about here that are important for the reporting of resources and reserves, how you monitor them, and so on. What I've done in the next few slides, and again they're very busy, I don't intend to go through them in detail, just to show you that for 3 of the chapters that I selected, the resource database,